My god. After a grand total of 7 rewrites, 11 months of thinking, and a great many hours spent slamming my head into the keyboard hoping words will miraculously coalesce from the clumps of gibberish that my forehead just bashed into existence, I bring you the final script in video form for what is definitely the hardest thing I've ever tried to explain. Ladies and gentlemen, are you religious? Because I'd like to introduce you to my religion. It's called Plot Holes Do Not Matter, and it is very aptly titled. I hate to be that guy who leads off with an anecdote, but this video was impossible to structure, so sue me. When I was in 9th grade, after we had finished reading The Most Dangerous Game, the short story by Richard Connell, we were discussing the slightly ambiguous ending of the story and how the use of the term on guard at the end implies that the characters fought with swords. Where did they get the swords? I wondered aloud. And then immediately, my teacher turned to me and said, "That's what you're worried about? You're fine with the character who became so good at hunting animals that he decided to hole up in a chateau on an island and hunt human beings instead, but you're hung up on where they got the swords." It made me stop and think, because it was basically a direct comparison of what some might consider a plot hole to the reason we should be fine with plot holes in the first place. I, like so many others who read and enjoyed The Most Dangerous Game, was perfectly willing to accept the absurdity of what was occurring because of a little thing called suspension of disbelief. Stories are often concerned with showing us the spectacular, or showing us mundanity in a highly entertaining way. In order to be engaging, stories tend to tackle the impossible, the improbable, and the other extremes of reality. And we want to enjoy stories, so suspending our disbelief of these extremes is kind of the price of entry. That's just how it works. Stories operate with givens. They'll give us information such as, in this world, dueling with laser swords is a viable way to go about fighting, or there are giant naked monsters that eat people and soldiers kill them with grappling hooks and swords. Even simple stuff like the main character is eccentric and weird in this particular way. If you're not willing to buy into that, then the story cannot operate. But if you're familiar with the concept of suspension of disbelief, then you're probably familiar with the idea that it can be broken. Something within the narrative will trigger a reaction in your mind that will take you out of the story and make you unwilling to dive back in. But what does this? What breaks suspension of disbelief? Ask most people and they'll hit you with that classic logical argument. If the story doesn't make logical sense, or in other words, if there's plot holes, then it breaks suspension of disbelief and ruins the experience. But this doesn't really add up, because there are popular, highly regarded, critically acclaimed stories out there that are so riddled with logical errors and things that don't make sense that it would be almost funny if it mattered. Some of these plot holes are kind of famous. Lord of the Rings. Why don't they just use the eagles? They could just use the eagles. There's no explanation as to why they couldn't just use the eagles. Why does everyone just forget about the One Ring when Isildur dies? Why did the trolls talk in The Hobbit but not in the original trilogy? How was Gollum originally planning on getting into Mordor before he changed his mind and decided to send Frodo to the Spider? Despite all these glaring logical errors, Lord of the Rings is still upheld as a must-watch masterpiece of cinema, and with good reason. Lord of the Rings is great, and the alternate opinion is extremely rare. But if suspension of disbelief in the story is so easily and commonly broken, how are these movies enjoyable at all? You would think that if you're not buying into the story, it would be pretty difficult for you to have fun watching it, but maybe Lord of the Rings is some kind of exception. So let's shift gears for a second and look at a story that is widely considered to be absolute garbage, in part because of its plot holes. In the many years since its release, professional internet intellectuals have torn Sword Art Online to pieces from pretty much every angle, including one of their apparent favorites, attacking the non-existent logic of the plot and pointing out every little hole they can find. Don't get me wrong, I'm not about to defend SAO's bland characterization, awkward pacing, and rampant obsession with sexualizing and then sexually harassing its many females, but I am going to argue that maybe the plot holes aren't the reason this show is regarded as such a dumpster fire. One of the more popular complaints is that it doesn't make any sense for Kirito to be able to save Yui, his adopted AI daughter, as an in-game object when given access to the game's code, and that it also doesn't make any sense that he wouldn't just log everyone out of the game if he had access to it. However, when SAO Abridged came along and did the exact same thing, nobody batted an eye. You know why? Because SAO Abridged is an absolutely phenomenal show. It goes beyond being a parody of SAO, instead really just using SAO as a basis to create its own much better story. And while it does poke fun at and solve a couple of SAO's plot holes, such as having the players be aware of the fact that the game they're playing is as irreparably broken as Jeff says it is, it leaves this one untouched. And nobody cared. SAO Abridged is super popular and widely acclaimed. But maybe this is simply the result of people assuming that the failings of SAO Abridged must have come as a result of the inflexibility of using the original SAO SAO as source material. So let's look at one last example, one that I feel is the most telling. In Digibro's massive video Psycho-Pass vs. Psycho-Pass 2, What Happened?, Digi prefaces a section of the video where he dives into the many logical holes and errors in the second season of Psycho-Pass with a brief discussion about suspension of disbelief. It's here that he essentially states that while there may have been plot holes in the first season of Psycho-Pass, he failed to notice or be bothered by any because he was wholeheartedly invested in and engaged by the storytelling. However, the second season of Psycho-Pass shattered his suspension of disbelief because he wasn't engaged by the storytelling.
Maybe it wouldn't have happened if I'd been more interested in the story or characters, or if the presentation had lived up to that of the first season. Whatever the case may be, because the series failed to engage me with its storyline, I found myself thinking more about its many logical fallacies than I did about its main narrative.
In other words, even if the first season had plot holes and logical errors, he would be willing to overlook them because it told an exceptional story with exceptional presentation that kept him wholeheartedly invested. But since the second season told a lackluster story with lackluster presentation that did not garner investment from him at all, the plot holes are suddenly glaring and a huge problem. Do you see what I'm getting at? 'Cause the pattern seems clear to me. We, as a collective audience, only really seem to care about plot holes and logical inconsistencies when the story is bad, but they don't seem to have an effect on the generally accepted quality of something. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, E.T., The Matrix, Harry Potter, The Dark Knight, all these stories are famously excellent, and they all have plot holes. Some of them are big, super noticeable plot holes. So how have these cultural giants reached the heights that they have if their logic isn't necessarily sound? Well, it's because those minor logical details are surface level and irrelevant to how a story functions. Think about it. Compared to characterization, thematic poignancy, propulsive plot structure, and even all the other non-story related stuff like performance, directing, editing, sound design, and music, plot logic seems especially small in terms of the effect it will have on the audience during the first viewing. And it's the effect on the audience that matters. In order to do that, to have an effect on the audience as intended, the story must function. Whether or not it makes logical sense has nothing to do with that function. No one enjoys a story because of the A to B logic of the plot, they enjoy them because of the emotion that stories instill in them. And that's the key word, emotion. Stories are emotional experiences. Their objective is to get you to feel, to translate empathy, to foster investment in a situation that is not your own, to bring you to new places, some of them upbeat and fantastical, some of them frighteningly dark and sobering. They're cathartic because they allow you to feel emotion in an environment that is safe, where fear of consequences can be abandoned for the sake of exploring concepts deeper and deeper and deeper. They draw us into worlds with characters you can understand and empathize with, not just for the sake of entertainment, but also for the sake of making you think, of giving you something to walk away with, a new perspective on the world or on yourself, a new understanding that you could never have gained from a simple explanation. The only way they can get you to that place is through execution of dramatic function, through getting you invested and engaged. That is the environment where a writer's ideas can ring true, pierce the barrier of incomprehension, and reach the viewer. These are emotional experiences, and it is that emotion that counts. Logic is the opposite of emotion, and though basic logic is obviously critical to living our everyday life, it's usually kind of unexciting and cold. If you've ever had to try to comfort a crying friend or family member, or you're a crier yourself, you probably know that sometimes logic just isn't what's important. It counts more than certain people realize, but considering that these stories are not actually real, their internal logic is just as unimportant in the face of intense emotion as it would be to a loved one who's bawling their eyes out for a reason that maybe doesn't make much sense. As for that whole thing about logic being unexciting, there are places such as with mysteries where the logic of something is important to the experience, but even in those cases, you aren't enjoying the logic, you're enjoying the feeling of intelligence, intrigue, and cerebral engagement that the story provides by going over plot logic. Not to mention, because certain stories are more thinky than others, maintaining the sense that everything makes sense can be important to creating a consistent tone. This is what I feel Digi's real problem with the completely and blatantly nonsensical plotline of Psycho-Pass Season 2 is. In the first season, Psycho-Pass established its world and tone as serious ones, deep diving into complex psychology and philosophy, and keeping the surface level, easy to notice logic mostly intact. Then, in Season 2, they completely toss logic to the wind for the sake of doing whatever fun action set piece or totally horrifying moment they feel like. Even if the writing and direction of Psycho-Pass 2 had been great but kept all the same logic problems, it still wouldn't be very good, because the obvious unintended dumbness would disconnect the viewer from from a world that once felt grounded and realistic. You'll notice that now we're moving away from the plot hole discussion and into one about the consistency of tone and the true breaker of suspension of disbelief, verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is basically the idea that a story does not need to adhere to our sense of reality, because when we experience a story, we immerse ourselves in it, become invested, and suspend our disbelief. So when we enter a story's world, it's more important for that world to adhere to its own internal sense of reality rather than actual reality. Even if there's something occurring in a story that would be highly implausible in real life, it doesn't matter, because we're not in real life, we're in the story's reality. When that story's reality breaks, however, such as with the blatant stupidity of Psycho-Pass Season 2 clashing with the serious tone of the first season, our suspension of disbelief goes out the window. Notice how the exact same stupid, irrational plot logic that ruins Psycho-Pass works perfectly in Spielberg's Ready Player One. That movie is about as dumb as I am, and is absolutely dripping with plot holes and things that don't make sense, things that you notice as you're watching, but it actually works to its advantage, because that's the reality that Ready Player One constructs. It's supposed to be a fun, fast-paced, quirky adventure story in a world where anything is possible, so the obvious dumbness actually becomes a part of the amusing mood. Me laughing at dumb stuff like the main villain having multiple personalities because of what is essentially a series of organ transplants is a problem because it breaks my immersion into what was once a semi-realistic world. But when I laugh at the fact that the vast player base of the Oasis is playing with VR headsets outside on the sidewalk, flipping around, fighting the air, and somehow not hitting each other, it actually draws me into the movie's world even more, strengthening the sense of reality that the film constructs. But even though obvious surface-level plot holes that you can notice while you're watching can be a small part of the verisimilitude, plot holes still aren't important because the vast majority of them are either not noticeable while you're watching, or are such a complicated twisting of the story's logic that suspension of disbelief should allow you to just shrug it off. People always like to complain after they've walked out of the movie theater how the big bad's grandmaster scheme didn't actually make any sense, but the thing is, if you didn't realize it while you were watching, it probably doesn't matter, because that viewing experience without realizing it still exists, and the fact that the logic doesn't make sense shouldn't be able to erase or change that experience. The Joker's plan in The Dark Knight doesn't make a lick of sense, but people still love it because it made for a more fun movie, and the lack of sense isn't so noticeable as to break the movie's extremely realistic tone. That's the thing, if you have to actively disengage yourself from the story and think about its logic to find or be bothered by a plot hole, it doesn't matter, because at that point you have actively disengaged yourself from the story, like someone sitting down for a movie and trying not to enjoy it out of spite or whatever. But hang on just a second, keep in mind that I am saying all of this from an analytical, critical perspective. None of this is to say that if you're a writer you shouldn't even try to adhere to basic logic, because if you don't, you're probably going to end up with a lot of blatant plot holes that punch holes in your verisimilitude. Besides, if you're utilizing elements from reality, such as with historical fiction, or just trying to represent real-world things in your fiction, like police forces for example, it is your duty to do your research and represent whatever it is you're representing as accurately as possible so as to avoid spreading misinformation. In that regard, real-life accuracy and plot holes can be important, and in a perfect world you'd be able to write a super compelling plot with characters that feel like real people and deep thematic exploration with no plot holes or real-life inaccuracies at all. But, here's the thing. Writing is hard. Like, really, really hard. So hard, in fact, that in all my years of trying, I still haven't quite figured out how to do it yet, and neither have a lot of people who think they have. In order for a story to feel coherent, you have to get a lot of seemingly disparate elements to all come together and line up perfectly, like trying to get a choir to harmonize, except the choir is made up of demons running around constantly shapeshifting, and some of which you need to kill if you want to get a good sound. When you write, there's going to be a lot of times when sacrifices must be made to preserve the narrative, and when it comes down to a choice between erasing a plot hole or creating a tighter, more compelling story, the correct choice should be obvious. You can make fun of Reki Kawahara all day for not doing his research, but I'm sure none of you would care if SAO was actually a masterpiece, just the same way as all of us are perfectly capable of enjoying SAO Abridged despite its plot holes. Because at the end of the day, that kind of stuff has nothing to do with how a story functions. The bare bones amount of logic you need to tell a compelling story is simply enough so that the audience can follow the story, make connections, and be engaged. Everything else is extra. So why is everyone so obsessed with this doesn't make any sense, or the characters could have just done that? Whenever people present these obvious logical solutions, I always have to ask, would you have enjoyed the story better that way? Erase some of these plot holes and the entire story disappears, or just ends right at the beginning. Why didn't they just use the eagles? Well, because then Lord of the Rings would just be 11 hours of Frodo complaining about a ring while him and the Fellowship ride some giant eagles. We don't experience stories because we want to see people do the most logical thing and make the right choice every time. We experience them because we want to see characters mess up and make mistakes, account for those mistakes, battle their circumstances, their own flaws, or both, and witness a satisfying conclusion to this battle. In other words, we experience stories for the conflict. If everyone is always making the correct decision and everything works out perfectly, there is no conflict. However, if you would just step back and let these characters make mistakes, you could actually realize that a lot of these mistakes inform character and improve the plot. Why didn't Holdo just tell Poe her plan in The Last Jedi? Well, because the movie just established that he is highly insubordinate and that Holdo doesn't trust him for a second. So for the love of God, can we stop citing plot holes as actual criticisms, please? It just drives me crazy, because whenever someone brings one up, they always seem like they're trying to outsmart the story. Like they've just proven that they're too intelligent to be fooled by the silly writer who devoted a large portion of their life and sanity to pouring everything they had into their work. If anyone ever wants to explain why a story was bad, in their opinion, plot holes are always the first thing to come up. And it just gets on my nerves, because focusing on plot logic like this is such an unhelpful way to go about looking at a narrative. It completely misses the point of what storytelling is really about and tends to lead to a lot of genuine works of art being dismissed. I should probably clarify, there's nothing wrong with just poking fun at or chatting about stories this way. How It Should Have Ended is one of my favorite YouTube channels. They're hilarious. But there's a reason these are parodies and not genuine criticism. And the reason is that plot holes do not matter. So the next time you want to criticize a story for a plot hole, ask yourself, is the plot hole really the reason I dislike this story, or am I just trying to feel like an intellectual? Because if you really genuinely dislike something, I can promise you that a good 95% of the time, the logic is not the problem.